thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you again today. Appreciated the opportunity we had yesterday to have a pretty extensive conversation about what we think are the quite huge opportunities that emerge from Bill 22 and some of the aspects of Bill 22 around class size composition, etc. And I know there's lots of questions about that. There's lots of questions about where do we go from here. But I want to start on a note because my role here principally will be just to throw occasional questions at Stuart and turn it loose, because he's a great guy and hugely knowledgeable, and I think can be a fount of great information for us today. But I want to start with the premise that people go into politics and people go into public service because they want to make a difference. They want to leave the world a little better place than what they found it, and try to share whatever talents we have with the broader society, or with the province, or with the school district, or whatever it may happen to be. To do that, we clearly have to be in a position where we understand public policy options and are able to embrace public policy options that can move, for example, an education system forward. So today I think we have a really special opportunity to hear one of the most distinguished social scientists in Canada, Dr. Stuart Shanker, and to pick away at him about the nature of the opportunity we have, and what the evidence would suggest should be best practices in the area of management of special needs. So this is a great opportunity for us, and I'm going to ask a few questions, but I know we want to get all of you involved and asking your questions as well. Because this is really, I think, a bit of a watershed moment in terms of the education system and improvement of the education system. So, Stuart, welcome this morning. It was great opportunity to be able to share a bottle of wine with you last night. I know I had no ill effects from that. I'm sure you didn't either. It's a great stimulant to conversation. We were thinking of actually bringing out the wine this morning. But breakfast wine's not yet part of the tradition here in British Columbia. But one of the things we talked about yesterday, Stuart, was the opportunity we have in Strong Start, which is pretty new to British Columbia now. About, I think, around 330 Strong Start centres. A lot of kids from early infancy through 4 years old attending there. And one of the things we talked about last night, and maybe we can begin on this point, is given we've got all-day kindergarten in place here, we've got some early education pieces, most promising of which I think are Strong Start. From your perspective, from your research and learnings, where would you say we should go in terms of the framework for managing special needs or identifying special needs, given those constructs in our early education framework?
Okay. Well, the Minister's job this morning is to try to keep me reined in. We are at I think he's right. I think we are at a watershed moment. And I had a very good conversation with the Minister and James Gorman and Rod Allen last night. And I thought the best way to start this morning was to tell you about the two men that are responsible for me being here today. Because it bears on exactly the question that George just asked me. Those two men were Stanley Greenspan and Fraser Mustard. So let me tell you about Stan first. You won't know who he was. Stan died last year, and in my opinion, he was the world's leading developmental psychiatrist, and he was my mentor in psychiatry. And Stan started studying self-control about the late 1970s, and he created 0 to 3 in the US, and then he went on and created another organization called ICVL. And he had a sort of blinding epiphany in the late 90s. Self-control was really a story about self-regulation, not self-control. That's what I'm going to try to explain. And I tried to explain it to the Minister last night, but the wine sort of got in the way for both of us. I was fuddled, and he kept on saying, "This is great." So we'll just park Stanley for a second. The second one is Fraser. we got this big grant that turned into a $10 million grant. And we really wanted to study self-control properly. And what we wanted to know was, first of all, what are the mechanisms? Can we explain this? Can we understand what's happening in the brain and in the nervous system? And then can we design interventions that actually work? And we are at a kind of a critical point now because we have all these programs that are being offered across the country. And I've had a chance to look at a lot of them, not as much as the minister, but a lot. And the problem is that they really don't work. Or they sort of work, but we could make them better. So what we wanted to understand was physiologically and in terms of what's happening inside the brain, how do we ramp these up so that we really do have interventions that are effective? When Fraser came to me, he wanted me to head up this council, and he knew what we were doing in the lab. And in the lab, we are very successful. And if you're interested, the CBC is actually running a show about a long-term RCT, a randomized control trial that we ran at Mary tonight on the National. And the results were published, and we got all kinds of really positive, well, it worked. So that's exciting. And also we've got some brain studies coming out within the next couple of weeks showing that we had a meaningful, not just significant, but a meaningful impact on reorganizing the children's brains. But this was in a very intensive clinical setting. This is in a setting where we have at a minimum 3 therapists per child, plus intensive parental involvement. So the question that Fraser had was, can you scale up? This is all wonderful, but the point of this Institute of Mary was to benefit, literally it's written in our mandate, to benefit all Canadian children. So how do we do this? How do we take these insights that you've had from the intensive lab setting and design programs and protocols that will reach every single kid? Okay? So that's what we've been working on for, well, since 2006, and we've introduced, as either Rod or the minister mentioned, we introduced these programs in Ontario, the Early Learning Program and Charles Pascal's Vision in With Our Best Future in Mind, which are very similar to what he just mentioned. It's a sort of a seamless model for children, essentially 0 to, we're now going 0 to 17. Originally we were 0 to 12. And at the heart of this is something I wanted to explain. Now, this is your job to see how far. Well, you have to decide how much detail you want me to go into. We know that everyone in this room, that the children that you are dealing with, we know that every one of these kids has problems in self-control. That's what defines them. They have these problems for incredibly complex reasons, and they're endlessly different. I was telling the minister last night, I work with a guy in London called David Scoos, who's one of the world's leading autism experts. And David told me recently he's been doing this for 30 years. He's seen 7,000 children, and no 2 of them were the same. Okay, that's one of the problems with using the spectrum disorder as our diagnostic category. It takes a long time to understand what's going on with the kid. You can't possibly do this in a 45 or 90-minute session. We reckon it takes us about 2 months before we have a solid functional assessment of that child's functional strengths and the areas that need to be strengthened. So the reasons why a child is having problems with self-control can be biological, it can be social, it can be a mixture of the 2. But our problem here, like everyone in this room, our problem is, okay, that's great. What do I do about it? What are the practices that I can introduce to genuinely enhance these kids' self-control? This was the question he kept on asking me last night. Is this doable? Is it doable in a public education system? Is it doable in such a way that if these kids start to have enhanced self-control, I will actually see the effects, the outcomes in their learning, that their educational outcomes will improve? I don't know how many times you asked me last night.
It was a lot of times.
It was a lot of times. So the answer to those questions is yes. All of those questions, the answer is yes. But the problem is that to get to the yes, first we have to understand what we're talking about. First we have to understand the distinction between self-control and self-regulation, because what we have learned, what's going to be reported tonight in the National, is that it's not actually a story about self-control. It's actually a story about self-regulation, whatever that is. Once we understand that, then what we had to do was we had to design practices that would enhance self-regulation so that we would see the improvements in self-control. We can do this, again, I don't know how many times you asked me this last night. You kept on asking me, can you do this with a child with FASD? Yes. We have a psychologist, two psychologists and occupational therapists that Dave Hutchinson's been working with in Saskatchewan, Brenda Whittam-Neary and Louise Burridge. The results that they have achieved in this population are astonishing. And it's not expensive. We don't require all these new equipments. Really, what it comes down to is understanding the new model and then understanding what the practices are that will enhance self-regulation. So you don't worry about self-control, you worry about self-regulation. So what we thought was, I'm going to pause because I'm thirsty. But what the minister said last night was it might, if you still feel this, that it might be useful to spend just a few minutes trying to understand what self-regulation is before we then move on to the more serious question, which I guess we'll do with Mike, of how do we institute this in a public education system.
Right. So have a drink of water. Again, I'm totally fascinated by this because one of the themes we've been articulating recently has been that the 520-some thousand kids in the public school system in British Columbia, every one of them is different, and therefore, as we think about that potentially 15, perhaps 20% who come with some learning challenge, whether it's psychologically based or physiologically based or whatever, they're different as well, and we shouldn't make a lot of assumptions going in about how to manage the needs because they're going to be different, and how to combine them in a classroom setting, I think again is different. So we will have for teachers, for principals, vice principals, superintendents, this challenge of kids potentially with fetal alcohol syndrome disorder, autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, ADD, and then probably 52 others that you would know that I would not. And how do we begin to with this opportunity we currently have to structure classrooms in a way that will be beneficial both to the kids who have those challenges and the kids who may not have those challenges. But I think let's start with self-regulation. I was very interested in what you said last night about that and how that relates to the issue of self-control.
Can I just ask George a quick question? Do you want me to just say something about the numbers we were talking about?
Sure. Yep. By all means.
All right. So the reason why Fraser came to me was, you guys all know who Fraser was, right? You don't know? Oh, all right, everybody knows. So Fraser had done in 1999 this huge epidemiological study across Canada, which Clyde has now been, systematizing. And Fraser was really, really worried about the numbers because did you see the news that came out this week about the U.S. has now revised their prevalence rate of autism down to 1 in 88. But what was very interesting was the governor of New Jersey has been in the news all week because New Jersey reported a 1 in 49 rate. And so he's been reassuring everyone that there's nothing toxic about New Jersey. He obviously hasn't been to see the Devils play, but his claim is that in fact it's really a reflection of the better accounting procedures that are used in New Jersey. And my suspicion is that he's right, because they do have a very systematic procedure. However, it's still based on hospital records. And so what we don't know is what's going on in the general population, which is what Fraser wanted. And we had a paper that came out a couple of months ago by a guy called Kim suggesting the real rate of ASD may be 1 in 36. The real rate of ADHD, we know, everybody here has heard, 7 to 12%, but we know that there's a gradient effect, so it's much higher in low SES environments. We had a paper that came out in Quebec, January, February, by a guy called Pingot. The rate of ADD is 16.8%. And these are astonishing numbers. And our concern in this room, and I could go on and on, I did last night to just see if I could depress him.
You did.
At a certain point, the wine didn't work. And the point here is not the question, are these rates increasing? That's not our concern in here. We've got scientists to look at problems. Our concern is, how am I going to handle this? This is an enormous burden on the education system. And this just represents the extreme. This is what the Minister just said. This represents the extreme of a continuum. So whatever those numbers are, he said 15 to 20%, I'm comfortable with that. But then we've got another 15 to 20% in the classroom that can be influenced by those children, that can become dysregulated if they're around, say, the kid who's climbing off the walls or throwing things. So this is such a massive issue that we had to start thinking outside the box. Is there a different way of addressing this? Because we can't go into a clinical model. It's too many kids. The reason they came to me was because Greenspan and my work was about, it wasn't about how do you handle the numbers. Our work is about, we actually think that the stuff I'm going to talk about is far more effective. And we have the data now to back us up. And so it was a nice merge, a nice meeting. And we reported all this, Fraser and I, in early year study 2, which is 2007. We were doing this as scientists who are interested in best practices. The reason I'm here is because Rod Allen became aware of all this, started to read seriously, and the feeling now is this is not. I don't want to present this as here's a pretty cool way that we might be able to handle this huge influx of problems. Rather, we think this is the better way. We think this is more effective, and it doesn't mean that we stop the practices that we're doing, but it does mean we can make those practices a lot more effective. Because here's the long and the short of it. You can be working with a kid 5 hours a week, 10 hours a week. If that kid's dysregulated, whatever that means, he's not going to learn. This isn't going to stick. If you want them to absorb whatever it is that the SLP is doing, that the OT is doing, or that the teacher is doing, you've got to get them regulated first. That's what I want to explain. That's the part that he wanted me to do this morning, so you understand what's actually going on, okay?
Yep, you bet.
So we've been studying, in North America, we've been studying self-regulation since around 1968. And it was the work of, self-control is as old as Plato. My favorite article that I've ever written is about how we haven't gotten that much past Plato. And either that means that Plato was incredibly stupid, incredibly smart, and we're incredibly stupid, or we've been asking the wrong questions. And I kind of suspect it's the latter. So what I thought we'd do is, this is Rod's idea. We'll just show you, I apologize if you've seen it before. We'll show you the paradigm that started this whole thing off. This was invented by Walter Mischel, and it's a way of studying self-control. This is how scientists study self-control. Okay. What's it?
Okay, sit in that chair. All right, here's the deal. Marshmallow for you. You can either wait, and I'll give you another one if you wait, or you can eat it now. When I come back, I'll give you another one, so then you'll have to. But stay in here and stay in the chair till I come back, okay? All right. I'll be back. Stay in the chair, okay? Okay.
Okay, so you get how the study works, right? You give the kid a temptation, and you have him wait 15 minutes, and then you tell the child, if you can wait 15 minutes alone, so we heighten his anxiety, you get double. My absolute favorite of this, when we did it, was this one little girl, and she poked her finger, and we're watching behind the one-way mirror, and she pokes her finger through the middle, and she hollows at the marshmallow. When we came in, it was perfectly impacted on my So now there's a couple of real interesting things about this study. There's a reason why we've done it. We've done this study over and over around the world so we can exclude cultural artifacts. And we get consistently the same results. And what we find, the first thing is that around 30% of all we can do this on 4-year-olds, around 30% can wait. 70% don't. And for a psychologist, that's very arresting. That you would get this consistent 30-70 breakdown tells us that in some way children are differentiating at a very young age, which brings us back to the strong start. Now, that in itself is interesting, but the more interesting part is because Michelle did this in the late 60s, we've had a chance to follow those children. And this is what we found. The 30% who waited score on average 210 points higher on their college entrance exams. They have very close to 100% high school completion. They have very, very low rates of obesity. They have very, very low rates of depression. They earn more money. They have more stable social relationships. They are highly likely to form a stable partnership with another person. So, in all respects, these kids are doing way better in life. And if you're interested, there's been some debate in the literature about how much we could trust these findings. So one of the leading figures in this area is a woman called Terry Moffat, and she replicated the study and she reviewed it all. And this was published last year, and she's from Duke, and she found that all of these results, these outcomes, are accurate. And so now we regard this as fairly robust findings. So now think about the children that we're meeting to talk about today, because they're all going to fail. So that's going to induce in us this kind of feeling of, I don't know, it's sort of like the situation that was in the US at the end of the last century when Janssen was going around showing that a child with an IQ of 90 or under was basically, we were wasting money trying to educate them. I don't know if you know this, but Janssen actually wrote a paper in 2002 saying that as an enlightened society, we should take these 90 unders and we should practice eugenics. Literally. I'm not making it up. And it's even called that. So you can, well, don't read it then, guys. So now what's happened is, as we shifted from IQ into self-regulation, which occurred in 2000 as a result of from neurons to neighborhoods, you can see that that mindset has now sort of transferred over into our area. And the feeling is, well, you know, if I've got a kid who fails this, that it really is, that what these studies are telling me is that his prospects in life aren't very great. So how much effort should I put into this child? How much money should I put into this child? How educable is this child? That was Jansen's term, the educability of a child, the educational potential of a child. And he's saying they don't have it, then we shouldn't be wasting, not only wasting resources, but we shouldn't be subjecting the other kids to this damaging influence. We should be investing more in those with the potential. That was his point. And because of, you know, some very ancient attitudes in the U.S. that go back at least 100 years, what we're seeing starting to happen is the self-control movement is inheriting the same attitudes that we saw in the old IQ debates of the 20th century. Okay. And that was his question, because the other question that the minister just asked was, we are looking at this within a universal class setting. So what we wanted to know is, can we actually affect this? Can we actually enhance their self-control? And you saw how they did it, right? They used cognitive competence. They're called cognitive competencies. I love the twins who do that. Did you see how the twins co-regulated? That's a very interesting insight into how children co-regulate. So we can come back to that later if you want. All right, here's the point. We were looking at all this, and I had been trained in a model by Greenspan. We had our own views about it. And I'll just tell the short version of the story. My wife had banned sugar from my house. And this was in 2005. And I came home late one night from a very trying day. My children knew that I had a bad day, and they bought me 6 butter tarts. And they were on the table, and everybody was asleep, and I was just like the twins. For only a few seconds. Okay, so then, you know, flash forward 3 minutes later, and the butter tarts are gone. And so now, you know, I've satiated whatever that need was, so now the scientist in me kicks in, and I start to think, well, that's really interesting. Because you know what? I knew that if had it been a different day, I wouldn't have touched them. Had it been a low-stress day, then if not my rational self, at least the part of me that's deathly afraid of my wife. Okay. So the next day, we started a fabulous study, and what we did was we repeated the task. But now, what we're going to do is we're going to administer the temptation and then wait 30 minutes and then repeat it. Only with one from us. We took the 30%, you always get this 30-70 break. We took the 30% who waited, and there can be all kinds of reasons why they wait, we don't care. We took the 30% who waited, and we tired them. We did it on 6-year-olds, and we tired them. And with 6-year-olds, what you can do is arithmetic. It's very, very tiring. You know, you're laughing, but there's actually a guy called Roy Baumeister who's done a series of studies on why arithmetic is so. If you're a math teacher, I feel sorry for you, because this part of the brain, which does the math, uses the most energy of any part of us. You know, the brain uses 40% of our energy, but it's this part. I was at 20%, but it's this part that uses about 40% of the brain's energy, the prefrontal cortex. So we tired these kids, and then we repeated it, and guess what? Over half of them can't wait. Then we took our 70% that failed, and we rested them. We did deep breathing, active stretching, and we played soft music. And we repeated, and now over half of them can't wait. This is very interesting. This distinction is the distinction between self-regulation and self-control. Self-regulation is a story about how the child manages stress. Stress is very expensive on a child. Stress can come in many forms. Stress can be physiological. For a special needs child, the first thing we look at are the stresses of sounds, lights, other people. These are very stressful on their nervous system. They have to spend a lot of energy dealing with these. Moving for them is highly stressful. So the first thing we look at are physiological stresses. Then we look at emotional stresses. These children suffer unbelievable anxiety. Anxiety is a huge burner of energy for a child. Then we look at cognitive. I just told you, arithmetic is very tiring. Cognitive tasks are incredibly tiring for a child. They burn a lot of energy. Then we look at social. For a child that's having trouble navigating his way through the playground, this is a huge burner of energy. And then finally we look at prosocial, because we want these children, we do want these children, James, wherever you are, to be empathetic, to be altruistic. And these are huge burners too, when you have to give up your piece or share it. For the kid with special needs, they're burning so much dealing with their stressors, which are going to be, in their case, largely physiological, largely biological. They haven't got enough left to control themselves. That's why they're having problems in self-control. So what we've got to do is we've got to figure out, as we're trying to educate them, they have to have enough energy in the tank that they can pay attention. If there's not energy in the tank, they can't pay attention. That part of the brain literally shuts down. I don't know if you want me to talk about that too.
Well, I do want you to talk about that, because I think one of the things I found very interesting from our discussion last evening is I'd mentioned in one of the wonderful things about my job is getting to visit a lot of schools. And one of the schools I visited in the Prince Rupert School District, and I apologize, it was a middle school. Hopefully someone from Prince Rupert's here can fill in the blank. But a wonderful school that structured themselves around the book Spark, which talks about the interaction of brain activity and physical activity, or physical activity and brain activity, I guess more precisely. But I mentioned to you last night, one of the rooms, I visited a room which had a huge box full of rubber balls. Actually, it was kind of foam balls. And this one boy, probably in grade 6, was diving into that to burn off energy. And he did a few dives and then came out and said, "Hi, I'm Johnny, how do you do? Pleasure to meet you." And it was great. I mean, clearly he had some challenges in the classroom, but was restoring his fuel through physical activity. But you mentioned that for many, and perhaps there's a distinction gender-wise here on that on the energy piece and how you get energy is rather than expend it. But I thought that's a hugely important one for us to talk a little bit about, is that whole business of fueling and refueling.
Okay. So physiology first, and then address the example.
Sorry?
Do the physiology first, and then explain why you explain.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. So what we're dealing with here is the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system has two branches: the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And the sympathetic, basically, every time a child has a stressor, the sympathetic is stimulated and it produces norepinephrine and adrenaline to meet that challenge. Now imagine that you're a special needs kid. Those challenges start the moment you awaken. Those challenges might be, the kid who is really crabby, really low affect, wants to shout or fight the second he wakes up. It tells us that that child is in a significantly depleted energy state. It's called an allostatic load condition. That's why he's woken up. Just waking up is a stressor. Eating is a stressor. Why is it a stressor? Well, there's a very interesting, there are a number of reasons why, but two principal ones. One is that when a child is under extreme stress, and these stresses now for special needs are largely biological, but they can be compounded by social, and in fact you can produce this in traumatized children. You guys have heard of Bruce Perry. You can get the same effects through just traumatization of use or neglect. When a child is in this heightened stress condition, the sympathetic nervous system is pumping all the time. Smells are a stress for this kid. Touch can be a stress for this kid. Getting dressed is incredibly difficult for these children. Why is it so difficult? It's because the tactile stimulation is very difficult for them. So we need to figure out what kinds of fabrics calm their nervous system. You'll find that with these children, everyone is different. For some children, have you got those kids, you've seen those kids that they come to school with the same pair of sweatpants every single day? What's going on here? Is it just that they're perseverating on these clothes? No. What's happening is they're self-regulating. And the feel of that fabric calms their nervous system down. For another child, it might be silk. For another child, it might be wool. We have to figure out what kinds of tactile stimulation calm their nervous system down. We can't come in and say to teachers, look, okay, here's an easy one. I got a kid who's in a meltdown. Go massage him. Ah, yeah, but every kid's different. How they respond to touch is different. For some kids, they need deep pressure. For some kids, they need light touch. For some kids, it's got to be fast. For some kids, it's got to be slow. So we've got to go through this trial and error. But we know when we've hit it because you can see in their face that the nervous system is calming down. Okay? Now, what's going on here? Every time the child, I will get to the principles of the kid in a second. Every time the child has a stressor, it could be the sounds in a classroom. It could be the noise of somebody moving their chair on a hard floor. For some children, that can be incredibly stressful. The sound of a buzzer can set them off for the rest of the day. These are easy things for us to fix. It's easy for us to handle the sounds on the floor. We just have the kids, as a classroom exercise, put tennis balls underneath the legs of the chair and desk. It's fun for them, and they begin to develop a sense of self-control. They begin to see that the scraping sound sets them off. We want them to become very much the agents of these changes. We're not just going to regulate them, we're going to help them develop self-regulation. So they learn their own nervous system. I can do this. I've done this with 3-year-old autistic kids. If I can do it with a 3-year-old autistic kid, we can do it with any kid. I don't care what's going on, they can learn this. That's what his kid in Prince Rupert was learning. Okay. Every time there's a stressor, the sympathetic nervous system pumps out some adrenaline. The way the body works is, I've got to recover from that adrenaline. So the parasympathetic, the cortisol system, kicks in to restore the body back to normalcy, to restore that equilibrium. Okay? If there's too much stress, whatever the causes of the stress are, environmental, social, emotional, whatever they are, so that the sympathetic is kicking in all the time, more adrenaline, more adrenaline, more adrenaline, the braking system, the parasympathetic, wears out. The braking system loses its resilience. The parasympathetic system has been overstretched. That's what an allostatic load condition is. It's when the parasympathetic system has been overworked and it can't return back to baseline, or it gets triggered too easily. So now what we've got to do for that, is that clear? Mm-hmm. So now what we've got to figure out with that kid are a couple of things. First thing we've got to figure out are what are the stressors on that child and how can I reduce them? How can I mitigate it in the classroom environment so I am not overtaxing his nervous system too much? That's not hard to do. So we do what Brenda and Louise have been doing throughout Saskatchewan is these classroom makeovers to produce low stimulus environments. They look very different from, these classrooms look very, very different from the classrooms you're accustomed to. And I'm sure we'll want to talk about that later. The next thing we're going to do is we want to equip that child with the self-regulatory skills so that he knows when he's starting to lose it. He knows when his sympathetic is out of control, and he knows what to do to calm it down. So George just gave us 2 great examples. The first one was Rady's example of the exercise bikes at the exercise bikes at the back of the class. For some kids, not all children, for some kids this is fantastic. It calms their nervous system down so they can come back and learn. Why would it do that? It does it because this is what Rady's book is all about. Exercise, provided it's moderate, stimulates the neurochemicals that create energy. That's what it does. It's the paradox of exercise. It's the paradox of spark, that you get out more than you take in more energy than you put out, because of the amount of neurochemicals that are stimulated, provided it's around 30 minutes and not overly intense. But that doesn't work for all children. So for some kids, and Brenda has a nice example of this, for some kids, diving in the balls has the same effect. Diving in the balls has this visceral impact on the sympathetic nervous system where it stimulates the creation of these of these neurochemicals to balance the system. For some kids, it's going to be going into something just like this table with some cushions underneath, giving them the chance to go into the seclusion and come back out when they're ready. I have seen this in operation. I've seen the kids disappear. I was with Chris Spence, and Chris and I were watching this. He's the director of TDSB, Toronto District School Board. And Chris has a fit because the kid goes into this area, and so we call the teacher over, and she says to him, "Don't worry, Chris, we've never lost a kid yet." And sure enough, the kid's there for a couple minutes, and then he comes out, goes back, and he goes back to work. So what's happening is for every child, we're going to try to figure out with him what regulates him. Then we're going to teach him to understand his own arousal states, to understand when he's starting to lose it. So we don't get to that point of throwing the desk. So we don't get to that point where he goes into this funk and we can't bring him back and he won't even respond to his name. We're going to teach him, we can do this, we know how to do it, now we're going to teach him to do it. And we're going to teach him, when you start to feel this little tingling in your arms, get up, go jump into the balls of Prince Rupert. And then he'll come back, and they always do. Because guess what? They have a huge drive to be like the other kids. They have a huge drive to want to be able to learn. And that's part of the problem. Their anxiety just grows and grows when they can't do it. And then they adopt all these defense behaviors to conceal the fact that they can't do it. But provided we don't push them too hard to provoke their anxiety, so we let them, this is the whole point of personalized learning, provided we come up with learning scaffolding that they can learn at their own rate, and we give them these self-regulating tools, what we can do is we can calm down their nervous system so that they have enough in the tank to pay attention. If you take a child, this is the last thing I'm saying now, if you take a kid who is in a high arousal state, he's in the high arousal state because of the stresses on him, whatever those stresses are, and you sit him down, and you've got the most wonderful SLP that you can imagine. So you sit him down, and now what we're going to do is we're going to work on prepositions today. You might as well save everybody's time. They're not going to learn. So what we do is we take our clinicians, this is what they're reporting tonight on the National, we take our SLPs and we train them first in self-regulation so that they know that the first thing they have to do when they're working with the child is they've got to figure out how do I calm his nervous system down. Then you can do your speech language. Then he will in fact learn. And the gains he makes will be meaningful. And we've reported this. So I said at the very outset that this is not, self-regulation doesn't represent, oh, well, here's this new program that we're going to introduce in British Columbia that's, no, this is a program that enhances all of the things that we're doing. What we've learned is we have all these wonderful things we're trying to do for these kids, but if we push them when they're hyper-aroused, not only is the kid not going to make the gain, but the poor teacher or the poor clinician is going to be frazzled by the end of the day. Everybody is.
So my capacity for self-regulation is not very good. So I'm going to, Rod or somebody can intervene here. I think the implications of what you said are huge for the education system in British Columbia, in the sense that I think we have had for some time, as we've struggled with inclusion models.
Yes.
We've often been persuaded that the way forward is to have comprehensive clinical assessments of children, and then use those assessments to drive the strategy to learn for them. And it would seem to me that while, again, we don't dismiss the value of comprehensive clinical assessments, but to take 2 months for each child, and given the number of potential candidate children we'd have here, it's out of our reach. Yep. But it seems to me the important thing that's being said here is rather we should focus on the self-regulation strategy rather than waiting and thinking about, is it ADD versus ADHD versus autism spectrum disorder. I mean, I'm sure the distinction is important, but it sounds rather like our resources would be much better spent building an understanding of self-regulation, building capacity in classrooms for children students to self-regulate, and then hopefully building a better classroom setting as a consequence of that. So is that a fair assessment?
Yeah.
And if it is, maybe you can expand on it a little bit more.
Okay, so the minister is raising two, I believe, really, really critical points. So the first point is this whole idea of inclusion. So let me just ballpark that for a second, because I think that's essential. Let's talk about diagnosis. So what we've done is we don't like diagnosing. And I've paid a lot of money to train my staff to be able to diagnose. And then what I discovered was that the diagnoses get in the way. And it actually has a negative effect on the families too. And then what happens is they get the diagnosis, and the first thing they do is they rush home. I mean, we had this one kid, and he got diagnosed at the age of 6 with conduct disorder. So mom went home and she looked up conduct disorder on the internet. And then we had a huge mess on our hands because she called crying, my son's going to end up in jail. But there's a deeper reason why we have tried to shy away. So what we do is, as we learn, we work very closely with our families, and as we learn, we always talk to them about these are your child's strengths, and every child has them. And these are the areas that we'd like to strengthen. Okay, and we don't use the word weakness at all. And what we've learned is that it really takes us a long time to figure out what that kid's strengths are. That you can take a kid that's highly aggressive, and once you can figure out how to calm his nervous system down and give him these tools, you get a totally different kid. You haven't changed that underlying biological pathology. We can't fix that. We don't know how to do that. But what we can do is we can mitigate the downstream consequences of that pathology, of those deficits, by calming the nervous system down. We are not curing a child. No one can cure a kid. Whoever tells you that you can, there's a study came out this week about, in the States, some big study saying that they can cure, X% of autism. I think it's horseshit. Okay, we can't do that. Maybe someday we'll be able to, but we can't today. But what we can do for these children is we can figure out strategies that help them regulate themselves. And when we do this, and it takes us between 1 to 2 years, when we do this, you're presented with, it's extraordinary, and we have a video about this that I hope we can show, but what we see is it's a totally different child. And the first sign, by the way, we have this criterion. How do we know when our therapy is working? We use 2 criteria. The first one is when the child starts to know that they're cold, or hungry, or tired. There's a very interesting biological explanation. I won't do it now, but essentially, under too much stress, the child can't monitor their internal states. They don't know that they're hungry. They don't know that they're cold. Think of these children who come and they're covered with goosebumps, but they don't know because all of their energy is being focused on dealing with the stressor. As soon as that same kid tells us, we have this case that we wrote up, this child, we knew the turning point came when he asked for a jumper, for a sweater. So that tells you that you've lowered the stress to the point where now he can start to monitor his internal state. If he can't monitor them, then of course his stress spins out of control because the hungrier he is or the colder he is, the more that's a stressor on him. So it's a vicious circle. And the second criterion that we use when the kid starts is smile. It's a dead giveaway, a real smile, not a fear grin. Because what the science of, there are 5 domains of self-regulation. The second domain is emotion. And what the science has shown since the early 90s is that positive emotions are just like radium. Positive emotions, like exercise, create the neurochemicals that fuel the body. That's why children learn better when they're happy. Literally, or curious, or interested. Literally because these neurochemicals are fueling the capacity up here to learn, to pay attention, to absorb information. Negative emotions do the opposite. Negative emotions consume vast amounts of energy. Fear, anger, anxiety, frustration. So we know when the child's starting to smile, it tells us on the one hand, we no longer have to deal with this emotion energy deficit. On the other hand, we're actually having the child's experiencing those emotions that will fuel. You know, everybody here knows that everybody's talking, like, I work closely with Jane Bertrand, and Jane is a huge proponent of play-based learning. This is why she's right. Because in play, it fuels these joyous emotions, which create energy to learn. Okay, so now the second point, then I'll stop. Inclusion. Because of these emotions, we want this to be in a natural setting. We want these children to be interacting with other kids that they're going to interact with. But what we've learned is that for various reasons, every kid in Canada needs us. There's a very, very small percentage, we think it's about 18%, who don't need us. The rest do, to varying degrees. Because there's all kinds of things that are going on in our society that are draining their energy system. I was telling the minister last night, did you know that Canadian children now sleep on average 2 hours less a night than they did 10 years ago? Talk about a drain on a kid's nervous system. We know, get James up here and talk about the participation rates in organized sports. We know that organized sports are the best thing we can do for these little brains, but our numbers are plummeting. And they're not plummeting because they're going into music. They're plummeting because they're watching TV and playing video games, which are consumers of energy. They don't produce, they consume. So there's a lot of things that are happening in our society that are creating this new generation of children that are stretched. And I have another graphic that I won't show now, but that Rod wanted me to show. What's fascinating about all this is, like I've explained, right, this braking system is starting to wear down, the parasympathetic wears down, and it's a predictor of the most astonishing range of long-term mental and physical problems. Mental and physical. That was Mustard's big discovery. So this isn't relevant for obesity. Obesity is not the cause. The reason why a child is obese has absolutely nothing to do with willpower. Nothing. And if you tell that kid that he's got weak willpower, he's a little guy, right? So he's 7, 8, 9 years old. You say you're weak willpower, you've got to make an effort or you're going to end up with type 2 diabetes or heart problem. You just made everything 10 times worse. Because you've shamed him, he's anxious now, and now these negative emotions are going to further consume energy, so he's in a constant energy deprivation state. That's why he reaches for the soft drink. That's why he reaches for the McDonald's or the crap. Because it gives him instant energy for a system that's chronically depleted. You want to help that child, you've got to figure out the stressors on him. Reduce the stressors. Enhance his self-regulation. So what I think is important in what the minister just said when we talk about inclusion is that we have in our minds the full picture of what's happening to children today. This full picture of the range of problems that children are dealing with. It's not just special needs. Special needs is the extreme of a continuum that's affecting a huge percentage of Canadian children. It could be the kid with, we now know that autoimmune, there's been one of the biggest spikes we've had is in childhood asthma. And now we have research telling us it's self-regulation. A paper came out at the University of Toronto 3 weeks ago. Obesity is a function of self-regulation. It's coming out over and over again. And I'm trying to explain why. It's because in a negative energy, in a depleted energy state, the child's on the trajectory where these things are going to wear down. And it's going to affect his health at some point, physical and or mental. That's why we need this universal approach. It should be targeted within university. Okay?
So, yeah, I suspect you feel a lot like me at this point, which is wishing we had about 3 days up here to talk about this, because it's huge in terms of the questions that you face as board chairs, as superintendents, as principals, as teachers. I think the implications of all of this are huge. We generally get to deal with a child for about maybe 6 hours of their day. And the other 18, they may or may not have chosen their parents well, and we may or may not receive them in the morning in a very difficult state, whether they're special needs or not. So the questions are huge here in my mind right now, and I'm sure there are in yours as well. But I guess, so just to, I guess, frame the challenge we have here at the moment. What we have come from is a very formula-driven model about how we should manage special needs in the classroom. We've said if there are more than 3 designated special needs kids in a classroom, the superintendent has to go in and determine that the situation is workable, etc. And we've said, and I hope rightly we've said, that saying 3 special needs kids, it means nothing. Every one of those kids is different. Some of them may, in fact, add very positively to a classroom setting rather than detract from it. And it's unfair to use the designations as a way to structure classrooms. But what Mike has to do as a superintendent in Surrey, and what everyone else in this class, if this classroom, it's kind of a classroom right now, and in this room has to do, is to think our way through in a post-Bill 22 world where we said, no, we're not going to be driven by formulas anymore. Where do we go from here? And I think that's the huge thing now. And because Mike is going to be my self-regulator here, and he's much larger than me, and
used to me,
and he's going to seize control here. But that's I think the where do we go from here question. And I know you've got a great video too. But Mike, let's turn it over to you and get some direction and structure back in our world.
No, it's a fascinating conversation, and if the microphone is on, can you hear me okay? Is this live? Okay. I'll move away from this podium in a little bit with a handheld microphone to provoke some table discussion and some questions. The thing every time, Stuart, that we get to work together and I hear you and I'm in conversation with you, is I'm struck by the question, when will what we know change what we do? Mm-hmm. And the answer that I keep bumping into is probably not for a long, long time, because we are shackled to so many norms, routines, and comfortable expectations. Even when we know that they're awkward and prickly, they're still comfortable. They haven't killed us yet. And part of evolution is keeping doing things that haven't killed you yet. How long will it be before we actually identify some of the things that are getting in the way of allowing the science to invade our practice? And this conversation is very important. Rod referenced it, the minister referenced it as a watershed moment, because we're talking about getting the science, the solitude. We're talking about 2 solitudes. The solitude of the great science and the research that's going on. If I had a whiteboard, and the board chair is happy that I don't, I'd be scribbling up the emerging Venn diagram where the science and the practice and the researchers start to overlap. And right now we have the good science. We have the book Spark that was referenced. I read that. Wonderful stuff. How much impact has it really made systemically in our classrooms, in our schools, in our lives? Not much. Little pieces, little points of light. Listen to Stuart speak in this province many times, and I've read his articles. How much is it impacting us? Because the other solitude that we're dealing with is a narrative that is being promoted, and certainly has been promoted significantly during this difficult year, that the classroom is an overwhelming place, that we have too diverse a range of students to manage, that it's a harrowing job. Well, how do we head upstream, get smarter? How do we start to turn to government and say which of the regulations that you continue to impose on us are actually getting in the way of better practice? How do we make sure that strong starts are not a nice thing that can happen when there's $1 available, but they become fundamental to the way this society structures a new order of kids living together, of kids living in their families, of kids living in society? And how do we start to understand that part of learning, along with the times tables, and the periodic table, and the gerunds, is the learning about self-regulation, is the metacognition that kids need to embrace. So that's just a little warm-up question for you. That's a big question. Essentially it says, when will what we know change what we do, and how do we break away from the predictable path of it not changing what we do. We can't afford to keep going the way we're going. We can't afford to have lost kids and a lost generation. We can't afford, in a time where exercise and physical activity is reducing dramatically, we can't afford to have more kids sitting on the couch, sitting in front of a video screen, and being less and less regulated, and then coming into an environment which is essentially harsh, unwelcoming, and prohibiting them from advancing through any of the stages they need to advance through. So, Minister, comment from you to start with?
That was beautiful.
Yep.
It was. I loved you
really
distilled
good,
the challenge perfectly.
That was really good.
Yeah. We're turning it over to you now.
Yep. So, Minister and I are going to start about.
That was it for me. That was my best shot. I'm out.
No, I love the way you framed that. And I think that is the challenge that we face, is precisely that one. That society is going in a whole lot of different directions that are not healthy to children. And somehow the expectation of society is we take those kids for 6 hours a day and we remediate all the damage that's done in the remaining 18 hours.
Yep.
And that's going to be very tough, I think. But nevertheless, I think Strong Start is the key. We get parents there; they start to understand some of the issues, and I think that comfort with being a part of the school system is an important piece of this. Having the opportunity for them to grow as parents, as well as their children grow, I think that's hugely important here as well. But Stuart,
I'd like to respond to what the minister just said. If that's okay, Mike. So I think the minister just made yet again a really important point. So let me tell you about how our study actually worked. We are taping this. So I gotta watch how I say this.
oh, don't worry, it'll all stay in.
No, it's Ontario. You'll see why in a second. Okay, so we do this intervention with these children, and the way it works is we sign a contract with the parent. He's absolutely right. You can't have this work without parents being on board, without parents being engaged. So we sign a contract with our parents. And the contract states that we will give your child 1 to 2 years, depending on the child's needs, of free intervention, where the child will meet once every other week for 2 hours with a team of therapists. And we'll pull in whoever we need. And in exchange, they sign a contract. And the contract states that they will keep a log of doing this at home for a minimum of 20 hours a week. On average, our parents did 26 hours a week. These are children with autism, our study. So you have to think about this, right? This is brutal, what we're doing to these poor people. Their stress is already so high. And now we're going to say to them, you've got to do close to 4 hours a day on top of this. So we thought what we have to do is, because we are scientists, we have to measure their stress. And we're going to measure their stress before, during, and after. So, before, unbelievably high stress, parental stress. We use PSI, the PSI indicator, parental stress inventory. At the 3-month point, their stress has gone up considerably. Well, that makes sense. You're learning all these things. And then it starts to drop. At the end of the program, parental stress dropped 41%. This is an astonishing result, because we know that those programs in which we administer 20 or 40 hours a week, or 35 for the child, to free up the parents, parental stress actually goes up. Why did it drop? Well, it drops for a number of reasons. It drops because the child's better regulated. It drops because we help the parents self-regulate. We work on their self-regulation as well. We have a mental health expert who does this. It drops because they've begun to understand their child, accept their child, love their child, not be irritated by their child or frustrated. So we change the whole self-regulatory environment of the family, which is the key. Okay, so then, and by the way, this is the part I didn't want to say, we do all this for a cost of around $5,000 per child. And we're trying to downplay that because we don't want this to be a driver for how decisions are made in Ontario. Because we want the interests of the child and the family to be uppermost. And this program is not going to work for all families, especially those families where you're not freed up to do 4 hours a day. So we want families to have choice. We don't want the government to make a decision purely because this is 5,000 as opposed to 60. Our question was, as we roll this out in the school system, as we do the stuff that the minister's been talking about, what happens to the teacher stress? So we ran a pilot. We've been running a pilot for 4 years in New Zealand. And we've measured teacher stress in exactly the same way that we've measured parental stress. And we got exactly the same results. What we fail to pay enough attention to is how hard it is on our teachers in this environment if their job has been defined as that of managing these kids, keeping these kids compliant, keeping these kids under control. I just spent 3 hours in Ireland. I sat in a classroom, and this teacher, she had a special needs class, and it was keep your feet on the floor, both feet on the floor, raise your hand. And it was like going from one kid to another, and I'm watching her. And I said, oh, this poor woman. I said to her principal afterwards, maybe you could buy her a massage. So one of the messages that we have to get through is that self-regulation is about the child, it's about the family, because we do have to have the effect that George is talking about. We do have to have, we got the kid 30 to 35 hours, we've got to make sure that this is going on at home. And it's about teacher self-regulation. And it's about teacher satisfaction. The teacher satisfaction, we're just coding it right now. The teacher satisfaction is 94% of this program. And this is in spite of the fact, I didn't tell you guys this, we made them do 1 day a week of PD every single week. They gave up their Saturday morning to come into us, and we get a 94% satisfaction rating. It's extraordinary. But then we tend to forget what drives these people to be teachers. We tend to forget that if we're seeing high rates of dissatisfaction, whatever it is, it's because they're overstressed. But if we can give them tools to manage their stress and the children's stress, they rediscover why they came into this profession. They rediscover the joy of teaching. I'm seeing, yes or no?
No. So it sounds like part of our challenge is to take the science, which happens at 40,000 feet, with great expertise, with clinical trials,
that's good,
with all of the controls, and we have to bring it down so it's manageable and we can wrap our arms around it. Whether we are board chairs, superintendents, principals, secretary, treasurers, anyone in the system, classroom teachers. And we have to understand this journey, not one that we are part of a scientific experiment in, because the work has been done. There are some truths that have been revealed. What does it look like, and how do we capture the narrative? And essentially, how do we disconnect from the old narrative? Because overwhelmed, an ongoing litany of overwhelmed systems, overwhelmed classrooms, too big, too diverse, etc., is not going to help us get anywhere other than tired. What does it look like for parents to know, as they work with their children and with the school system and with specialists, that there is going to be an increase in stress before things level out and drop off? That's helpful to me in any of the things that I'm doing. If I understand what the journey is going to look like, and when I hit the first hill on that run, I know that there's a flat spot and then there's a downhill coming. That's helpful. What does it look like for the teacher in the classroom to understand that this isn't another moment in time? A government announcement, a district goal. This is something that's becoming fundamental to who we are and the way we do business. And we're having to reinvent education. And we're having to reinvent it in spite of the fact that you know and I know that there are lots of times where people will come in and in spite of knowing intellectually that some things should change, what they want is school the way that it used to be. You can almost hear, you know, if only for more chanting of the timetables and a bit of corporal punishment, we'd have this sucker licked, right?
Absolutely.
So how do we get the message out?
Yeah.
How do we tie in Strong Start? How do we tie in convincing government to say, and convincing school districts to say that some of the routines that we currently engage in are no longer productive? That doesn't condemn them or demonize them. It was the best thing we knew. but we now know better things. And we have to change. I was thinking this morning as I was driving in, remember those old commercials? I'm not advocating this, but it's an interesting way to change people's perspective. Remember those old TV commercials about the 60-year-old Swede who was fitter than the 30-year-old Canadian?
I do. Participaction, a step in the right direction.
There you go.
Now that I'm becoming a 60-year-old Swede.
Now, but we're going to find out that the 90-year-old Swede is faster, fitter than the 60-year-old Canadian. But the fact is that there were very deliberate messages that were out there. When parents come to Strong Start, and I've hung around some Strong Starts, but basically very briefly and sometimes to play, and then I get thrown out because I'm not playing properly. And my parents can't come with me. Do parents know? And are we deliberate enough in connecting the dots, especially for parents who come to that center from a place of challenge, from a place of diversity, from a place of difficulty, and sometimes from a different culture? And you know, if you live in a community where there are many cultures coming into the community, that some of the views of education are the views of the middle of the last century. More homework, more regulation. More homework, more authority, more compliance is what's needed. That isn't working. So how do we, to government, get the message out in a well-articulated, well-architected way so it starts to fit together and it doesn't sound political, it's foundational to the societal change?
Well, great question. So I'll go back to one of the points I raised, pardon me, yesterday, which is the success that's enjoyed in relatively self-contained and socially connected school districts and communities like Revelstoke and Fort Nelson. I think it's not by accident that there's the one hospital that the new baby is kind of welcomed into the world of the early learning framework in that community. And right from the start, I think there's a connectedness to it that I suspect goes to the point which Stuart makes about a sense of well-being from the start. They're singing, they're dancing, they're doing all kinds of stuff together, story time together, and I think it does create a sense of inclusion, social connectedness that I'm certain is very healthy for all of the participants in that. And so I guess the question is, you know, not every community is going to look like Revelstoke or like Fort Nelson. You've got one of the most, the largest and most diverse school district in the province. And how do you take, you know, something that may work in a much smaller setting, and how do we take the lessons from that and apply them to the big districts like Surrey or Vancouver? And I guess, you know, that's a good question to which I don't have a good answer at this point. I guess the first question you have to ask is it valid to say that something seems to be working in those smaller, connected, socially connected communities? So I'll turn it on to you because I don't have a good answer to the question. Maybe you got a better one.
So let me answer by telling you what Brenda and Louise do. So what they do is they'll come in, and let's say they've been really fortunate. They get to work with a school. So they meet with everyone. They meet with the teachers, and the principal, and the vice principal, and they meet with and the receptionist comes, and the school bus driver comes, and the custodian. So everyone is on board, and they talk about self-regulation. They get everyone in this community to understand the stuff that I've been doing, but they do it more slowly. So it strikes me that that's what we're doing right now. And I spent enough time with him and with John Gateman, I don't know where John is, and these guys get it. So if the superintendents got it, then what, and I've done it in Ontario with Chris Spence or Mark Zonerfeld. Once the superintendent's got it, he becomes a driver for this. He becomes this agent for explaining everything that Mike just said, because Mike has 30 years of science backing up what he's saying. We have tons of review articles telling us that punitive approaches don't work. They make it worse. In the U.S., they won't. I once was down in the States and I had a U.S. senator say to me, "I don't care what your data tells me." I didn't know how to answer him. Okay? And he didn't, by the way. And his state is doing real well. But we do up here. And so I don't know if that's an answer to you, but I think that what Mike is hinting at here is that when you have a process where it's driven top down by guys like Minister Abbott, James Gorman, Rod Allen, and the superintendents see this, and they can get this message through, then I think what happens is they have the resources to make these changes. So you're doing this. Like, you can do it through your schools, because your school can become a community hub. You can do it through Strong Start. But the key here, and this is all I was going to say, I don't believe in parent education anymore. I don't think it works. I don't think you reach the ones that need it. You reach the ones who come back are the ones who didn't need to be there. What does work, which Strong Start presents us with, is parental engagement, parental involvement. We can model, they will come to you once they're relaxed, once they trust you, they'll ask the questions. What do I do? I've got a kid who won't go to sleep for 2 hours. That's why she's letting him watch TV. How do I handle it? So now what we can do is we can engage in these constructive dialogues and help them. Anyways.
So let me just add a little bit. So yesterday we were having a chat about these and related issues, and someone mentioned that they thought that in the 21st century that schools were going to become the center for social inclusion and connectedness that churches had been in earlier centuries. And I think it's a really interesting and very valid suggestion or comment, because clearly in our British Columbia society, which is very diverse on faith base as well as every other base, I think. But regardless of that, we also see, with my family and many families, we're moving away from a connection to a church and moving to a different basis for social connectedness. And it may well be that the school will represent that role that the churches once played of being the. But if they are, it would seem to me that it has to start at Strong Start. We have to have much stronger linkages between the health ministry and health agencies, children and families, all of these agencies, which in a larger setting tend to operate, I think, in silos, but which in the Revelstokes and Fort Nelsons, because everybody knows everybody else, they tend to work together and very tightly. And so, if we can, through Strong Start to make, we don't want to supplant churches. For many people, churches remain the center of their social connectedness. But there's a whole generation of I think, young people who are searching for a vehicle of social connectedness, and potentially Strong Start could be that. But it's only going to work that way if the public health nurses, in their visits to the young mom and the infant child, say, one of the things you might want to look at in a few weeks or a few months, when you feel comfortable, drop into the local Strong Start Center. They'll welcome your baby, even if the baby is only 4 or 5 months old. It'll be welcome. And you'll be surprised how your baby looks around and connects with what's going on. And I think it's and again, I don't know if we're going to have time to talk about this, but one of the really fascinating pieces last night, talking to Stuart about, was that even a child born with FASD or some other challenge, they can build some connections in their brains as a consequence of the self-regulation piece, the comfort, and just the social connectedness that can come through a vehicle like Strong Start or even I presume, kindergarten for some. Sorry, back to you, Mike.
I think the story out of Saskatchewan and the work that was done there is enlightening and should embolden us to just get on with that. And again, to break away from the expectation that there's a very low ceiling for some kids, and this is a matter of managing and controlling versus enabling capacity. And putting kids in conditions where those synapses will connect. I was reading John Abbott's book, Overschooled but Undereducated, and he does a brilliant job of looking back and looking forward. And as he looks back, if we could chart the map of education and education decisions, you can put a point in time here where a government or a leader or a bureaucrat decided that this is the way we're going to go, and look at the decisions that were driven by that. And then there's another point in time, and it goes and it goes and it goes and it goes. And he is particularly critical of the British system, which he knows best. It strikes me that as we stand now, here we are, we can't do anything about those decisions in the past, but how do we look at moving forward, and how do we go into our various silos? You mentioned public health. I think about capital projects and school buildings. What are the expectations and the regulations about school buildings? It drives me a little bit crazy, which is a short journey, a little bit crazy, when we still talk about split classes rather than multi-age groupings or family groupings, and it's still the norm or the desired place to have a single grade grouping. I sometimes wonder what would happen if a pair of twins were born 1 minute before midnight, 2 minutes after midnight, on December 31st, January 1st. The rules would have us put those kids in 2 different grades for 2 different years. So when you do that and say, really? And of course that's the rule base, then we start to go, well, what if it's a day before and a day after? What about 2 days? So we've got a number of policy and regulation norms that we have to get into. Last comment from me, and then back to you, and then we'll break for a few minutes, and I'm going to ask tables to pose a provocative question, either get it to me or put your hand up after the break. Let me tell you what we're trying to do in Surrey, and this is an emerging story. The board met with the City Council recently, and a couple of resource people around the notion of common ground. Because what we recognize is when all of the different silos and sectors build their stuff and locate their resources in different places, there's a built-in disconnection. Where's social services? Where's the school? Where's the community center? Where is the senior citizen center? You mentioned yesterday the wonderful connection between kids and seniors. And every time we hear that story, we go, of course. But how often do we get deliberate about placing senior centers adjacent to schools so that the likelihood that kids can deliberately be engaged with seniors is increased? So in Surrey, we're talking with our city about co-planning, about developing new areas, new projects that will tie things in together so that the reasons not to change will be eliminated or at least decreased. If we keep doing what we're doing with all of our system norms, we're going to continue to perpetuate the likelihood of isolation and disconnection.
Well, I can only say bang on to those comments. I think in part by design, in part by accident, we've done some good things in British Columbia, and I think that's one of the reasons why we're doing, relatively speaking, reasonably well. But I also emerge from today, as I emerge from most days, this sense that we're only scratching the surface in terms of the things that we can do or we should do, the things that we do in relation to the broader community. And I think, again, your analysis is absolutely on the mark, that we've had for 100 years a sense that, well, the school's a separate place. It's a part of the community, but it's not really a part of the community. The door's shut at 4 o'clock, and that building sits empty until magically at 8 o'clock the next morning it comes alive again. But we've taken the opportunity through Strong Start to make a connection. I think that's been really good. But again, I think we're just scratching the surface in terms of the real value that Strong Start can bring to communities and bring to schools. The neighborhood learning centers, I think, were a great idea in terms of, well, if we're going to build a new school, let's put a place in where there's going to be a connection. And some small communities have done this brilliantly, and I think some large communities have done this brilliantly as well, where it might be a theater, community theater in the school that draws them together, or it might be a daycare center, or whatever it may happen to be. I think all of these things are good. We just have to, and this is maybe the thing we think about over the break here. Where are the next steps? What are the next things we do? How do we start, rather than just scratching the surface on this direction? How do we really continue to to dig towards that stronger connection. Again, I get very emotional when I think about the youth and the seniors connection, and where do we go with that? Over to you now. Having got you emotional, and throwing the microphone in front of you.
You guys don't need me, you know that?
Oh yes, we do actually.
I really wanted to show my video, but I'd also like to talk about a case. Can I talk about one case? I haven't done any cases today.
When have I ever been able to say no to you?
Well, you do it, but you do it very nicely. Only afterwards I realized that son of a bitch did it again.
I say yes.
Yes. I say yes.
So we had a kid that was brought into us, 6 years old, and this was quite a few years ago. And he was a little guy that was getting expelled, and I'm not exaggerating, expelled from SK. And he was a handful. So we worked with this little guy, and his problem was exactly what I've been talking about today. And by the way, that whenever we work with people, if they come to us with their interventions, we say to them, tell me a story. Give me one kid that you actually helped. So I'm going to give you this. We don't just talk the talk, we walk the walk. So with this little guy, what we did for him was a number of things. We gave him one of those cushions, a disc. And it's knobbly on one side, flat on the other, so that he could, it's a way of regulating their nervous system while they're sitting. He was a little guy that needed an awful lot of physical activity to down-regulate, to keep in control. And so we built in all kinds of things for him during the day in SK grade 1, grade 2, grade 3. So I saw the family just recently, and the kid's about to play AAA bantam. Okay? And so I'm talking to the parents, and so I said, I'm begging you, let me tell the story. Let me write this up. And they said, no, because this kid now he's an FASD kid, all right? There was damage. Mom was drinking and not knowing that she was pregnant. So she said, why should he have to carry this through life? So I agreed, right? So we won't write this up. But when I saw this kid, what's extraordinary for me is I know what's happened. And what's happened is that with these children, they've had severe damage to it's called the medial prefrontal cortex. That's what's happened. And the medial prefrontal cortex is what calms down, which regulates the limbic system, which is where all these violent impulses come from in these kids. The limbic system literally grows. This is what George was talking about. It literally grows. So now what we've done is, if the prefrontal, the front part of the brain, which dampens it down, if it gets overloaded, it shuts down as a defense mechanism. And then the kid's out of control. And now the kid's out of control and things are spiraling and he's getting expelled and he's going to get punished. And you know where this child might have ended up with. Instead of he came into my office wearing a jacket with AAA Bantam on it. It's lovely, right? It's really, really cool. So how did this occur? Well, what happened was we stopped the limbic system from growing. That's what you can do. We've now calmed down the PFC, the control system in the brain, so that it can stay in control. So that all these things we're taught that we want them to learn. We want them to learn, take a breath, count to 10, choose something else, figure another way of expressing your anger. So now, provided that the system's calmed down, it can do that job. If the system's not calmed down, it can't do that job, okay? We see a child like this. And here's what we know, and this is why I wanted to show the video, okay? We know we can do this for every single kid. Every single kid has a gift. I loved what the minister just said. For some kids, it's going to be acting. For some kids, you've got Adele Diamond in BC showing us that we can get the same effects that I've been talking about through music, taekwondo, and yoga. And those are only the first 4 that we've looked at, and sport, obviously. So, where's that child going to end up? We have no way of knowing. I've got this little guy, he's got some biological issues, so what? I do too. I've got a wonky S4-5. If I overdo it, my back's going to go out. I've learned how to manage her. My wife's learned how to manage me. So the point is that I don't want to take this kid now when he is 7 years old and create a trajectory for him that's going to lock him into that trajectory. I'm going to give him a label that's going to lock him, that's going to be his life. Because at the age of 7, I have no way of knowing what his potential is. I have no way of knowing where that gift's going to come, but I do know one thing. Every single kid we've ever looked at has a gift. And if you're unfortunate like me, the kid's gift's going to be hockey. I really don't want to spend my life in an arena. But that's my child's gift. I would have preferred it if he liked reading. That would have been nice. So,
Or basketball, it's warmer.
no, I wouldn't have chosen basketball either. Very hard on the knees and ankles, as we can both tell you. Yeah, basketball's warmer. Okay, so the university is all excited about this, and so they made this video because we're trying to do some fundraising for it. But the message, I just tell you one thing. I forgot the guy's name now. It's Justin. It's this kid with a developmental disorder, a chromosomal disorder. Justin, you'll know him when you hear him. But he represents for me exactly what we're talking about here. Here's a kid who's now become this extraordinary singer. What's his name? No. Are you kidding me? Who said that? No.
We don't know many other Justins.
No, he's a real...
Justin Trudeau?
Justin Hill. Justin Hill, is that the guy? Justin Hill? What's you guys listening to? I mean, seriously. He's not even Canadian.
Country and Western.
Anyways, this is what we mean when we talk about what kids can go on to do. He's the one singing, and he volunteers his services.
No, darling, I can't take your thirst away, but I can show you to the sea. And while you're walking on your path unknown, say, will you think of me? Well, time will tell, and I wish you well.
What are we after here? We are after a genuine societal revolution. We want everyone, not just parents, but parents, educators, physicians, anyone who's interacting with children. We want them to reframe a child's behavior. We want them to be asking, why are we seeing this?
Time will tell, and I wish you well.
Our basic premise of early brain development is the following. That the fundamental unit of early brain development is the dyad, not an isolated brain. It's the brain-to-brain hookup.
Although we are certainly born with a set of genes that encode our physiological, our arm length, our nose, our eyes, our skin color, our hair color, the brain is not like that. The brain is developed in a way that requires experience to develop.
So the distinction that we make in our model, it's called a developmental pathways model. And the distinction is between those problems that the child is born with, biological challenges, deficits, and the way these have what scientists call a cascading effect, the way this leads to downstream problems. And those downstream problems might be in things like self-regulation, language, social interaction.
So many times I've seen those ghosts before. I've watched them dance around your bed.
Autism is in fact a neurogenetic disorder. And we are learning every day almost now new aspects of the kinds of biological challenges that these children have.
Tristan used to get on those toddler cars that they would straddle and hold on to, and he'd go ramming from one end of the house to the other. He'd get under the table and he'd bang his head.
Why does this happen? Well, what's happening is that if the child who's born with these neurogenetic deficits is highly sensitive to visual stimulation, auditory, tactile, smell, what they tend to do is shut down interactions with their primary caregiver.
The problem of autism is it effectively stops the ability of experience from entering into the system that turns on genes, because we know that experience changes genes, turns on and off genes, and that's necessary for the brain to develop normally.
He's at an age right now that this is crunch time. You need to do something for him now. We cannot afford to wait until he's older and will absorb less.
The way the therapy works, or floor time works, it's now quite famous for being a play-based approach, but an awful lot of thought goes into the games that we play with the child. Here's a typical example where Chris is working with a young boy, and at the beginning you'll see that he is completely disengaged. He's unaware of Chris, he's unaware of his mom, and he is wandering aimlessly about the room. But our goal here is to get that social brain cooking. It's to get the child engaged and interested. You know, she got him engaged all right, and she did it fairly quickly. What is the result? Well, the result is that in front of your eyes, you see a child who 1 second ago was wandering around in his own little world, is now not only paying attention to Chris and his mother, but he's counting. And he not only is he counting, he is having a ball. Now this child is initiating. Mom is a part of all this. We need mom to be doing this at home, because in order to get what we call a dose effect, in order to get these parts of the brain really cooking, these parts of the brain that have had trouble talking to each other, in order to get them hooked up, integrated, mom and dad have to be doing it in every opportunity that they have.
The social reward system is really what's behind all social interaction, love, bonding, the joy of being a parent, the joy of being a child, of loving your parent. All of that is part of this social reward system. I've developed a model of the social reward system and its relation to the frontal lobe control systems and the limbic center, and I would like to further test this with a large longitudinal sample to look at the precise variables that go into developing this system. And without further funding, we couldn't do that. And I think it would be a real shame, because now that we've done all of the main work that goes into developing these variables, without a longitudinal study, we really will fail at understanding something so critical for human development.
At this age, this kind of a study has been instrumental in changing my son's life, my family's life. And from the other parents that I've talked to, it's been the same for them. We need to keep it going.
When you come back from the great beyond, with moonlight in your hair, I will meet you where that dark road ends, and it won't be long until we're there.
Anywhere from a quarter to a half of all of our children are having sufficiently significant self-regulatory problems that it will affect their downstream psychological and or physical well-being, and probably both. So this is a big issue. If you understand a child, if you look at the child with this lens, not only will you see a different child, but as you start to tailor your interactions with your child to help that child, a new child will emerge, and that child will blow you away.
And once again, talk about way back when. Oh, but until then, well, I wish you well. Oh, I wish you well.
We're going to break in a moment for coffee, and I'm going to pose a challenge to you and ask you to be prepared to either get me a question or raise a question after the break. As I watched that again, because you shared it when you came to Surrey a few weeks ago, I'm reminded, and again, it connects to the John Abbott book. If we had a one-pager that described the purpose of public education when it was invented, it was much about sorting and ranking, it was much about keeping young children occupied for a time. It was advantaging further the already advantaged. It was having a large discard pile of cheap labor, and that's not the world we live in. And yet, there are still artifacts in the structure called education that remain from that time. How do we sever those artifacts, and how do we build on the promise, the hope of the promise, the new child that you described on camera that emerges when we are smart and thoughtful, compassionate, and committed to making a difference? So the challenge for you folks during the break and the table talk, and it's now just approaching 10:30, so we will start at 10 to 11. We'll have a 20-minute break. The challenge is, what does it look like? What can you commit to in your operation, your school district, your system, that would cause us to further sever the connections to the old and deliberately start to build some new ones? And in that question, you may have a question for Stuart or the minister, or a suggestion or an ask. Here are some of the things that will be helpful to us as we start to build. It's system synapses, isn't it? We're developing system synapses just as the neural synapses get developed by use, by creating, and then by recreating and creating over and over and practicing. So there's your small, insignificant question between your coffee and your muffin. See you at 10 to 11. Thank you.
That was fabulous. Yeah. Well, that was incredible.
Okay, we are back together. If you can take your seats, please. I've had a couple of questions and provocations from the audience, and we'll also get some hands up for further questions in a few minutes. Our commitment is that we will be finished just ahead of 11:30. James Gorman will come up to close the session. I know there are people with planes, trains, and automobiles to deal with soon afternoon. Here's the first question or prompt to both of you. It's a question I have, certainly, and I heard it from a couple of people during the break as well. And let me frame it through my own thinking and then get to the specifics. I think too often we confuse the means with the end. In fact, the means becomes the end. So we get fixated on something and we forget that whatever that thing has a greater intention. And there are lots of examples from our sector and others, but I don't want to distract by rolling out those examples. Let's talk about categorization of kids. The labeling. Some testing takes place, an IEP is developed, there is a label, in some cases there is some funding. We sometimes get stuck in a place where it's all about the label and not so much about the child and the journey. And the struggle becomes, are we over-labeling, are we under-labeling? There are too many kids with this identified need. Let's talk about the construct of the IEP versus the end in mind, which is to create, as you said in your video clip, Stuart, the emerging child that develops beyond what might be the demonstrated capacity that caused that labeling to be assigned. So what are we doing? Because we've got two extremes. We've got, in some cases, people are saying simply eliminate the labels and everything will be better, and every child should be recognized for her or his talents, skills, abilities, and challenges. And the other extreme, we're saying more precision in labeling, more diagnoses. What happens if we end up in the unidentified world? How are we going to engage educators and parents in dealing with specific challenges? If we end up in the labeling in a more precise way, how are we going to resource that and make it useful rather than an end in itself? So, Minister, you have heard lots of representations from lots of people along that continuum. We need more diagnoses, more labels, more funding, more discrete funding, more expectations around IEPs, and we have other people who are saying, let's get to the child.
Right.
Take it.
I'll begin with this, that as the tourist in this area of public policy, obviously I've enjoyed a number of what we like to refer to as aha moments, where suddenly something locks in terms of, wow, I never looked at it that way before. I had an aha moment, I guess probably about 6 or 7 weeks ago. A group of the social ministries, which includes education, drew together some experts from UBC and elsewhere. Stuart was not included on that occasion. He would have been a delightful addition, but he wasn't there. But there were some great people, Adele Skinner, Pat Miranda from UBC there, talking about the issues and how government could work more in a more integrated, cohesive fashion to deal with the challenges that emerge, and not just in education, but in all ministries. And the aha moment for me that day, and I frankly had never heard this before, was Pat Miranda suggesting that, you know, we shouldn't be looking at FASD kids, fetal alcohol kids, as the write-off that we have tended to do. That rather they had plenty of opportunity, and Stuart's confirmed this today, plenty of opportunity to learn. The self-regulation will be the key to that, but plenty of opportunity to learn. But she went on to say that regardless of the early learning challenge that you had, or the general learning challenge that one had, the menu of things that one would do to try to overcome those challenges was quite similar, whether it was FASD, ADHD, ADD, autism spectrum disorder, whatever it may have to be. It tends to be a lot of the common items on the menu. And I think that's a hugely important piece from our public policy perspective. So let's not be blowing our resources on trying, at probably often too early an age, to try to diagnose precisely what the challenge is. Let's come at them, because whether you've got the next Isaac Newton as a child, or whether you've got someone with ADHD, basically all the same kind of learning sensory strategies are the same, regardless of that. And I know Stuart will be able to articulate that much more effectively. So that was a big aha moment for me, was that it's the things we do, not the diagnosis, that we ought to be pursuing, because they're all the right things for all of the kids. So secondly, around the issue, I think it's, we have over time developed a funding follows diagnosis model here, and it yields now $866 million in the block going out to school districts. It is my view that school districts, if we're going to do this right, and if we're going to adopt the paradigm, the model that has been suggested by Stuart and others, I think we'll not only need that 866, we'll need all of the resources contained in the Learning Improvement Plan. We've tried to take some of the, I think, relatively unconstructed pieces out, like class averaging. That'll free up some resources that I think can be way better used in this area. But we've got to get away from the 866 being driven by the diagnosis, but I think you're going to need all of those dollars to do this right, notwithstanding whether we have diagnoses or not. So I guess that's where I would begin here again, and it is looking at kids as individuals. It's develop individualized learning strategies, and trying to deal with the kids as they come to us, and using, I think this self-regulation piece is central to the future success of it. Over to you, my friend.
That's pretty good aha moment. Seriously, that's pretty good. You're going to have to put me on the clock now because you had some good questions, all right? So Rod wanted me to show you a slide that we've made that addresses this. I should just tell you that diagnosis is very, very difficult. And so what we did for our study, we had to make absolutely sure that these kids really were on the spectrum. So we reassessed every single child, and half of them were not on the spectrum. Half of them either had PDD or regulatory disorder. And there's a paper that came out yesterday in Pediatrics. I don't know if you've seen this yet, you will, showing that some percentage of autistic children get cured. Autistic children do not get cured. And so our feeling was, because we've been involved in this kind of work, that they never had autism. And at the end of the day, the reason why we worry about it is we don't want to give families false expectations. It sets them off on this journey looking for the cure. What we really want them to do is understand their child, work with their child, and help their child. And what we commissioned when we started this work was we had a postdoc called, it doesn't matter, Alfredo Tinajero, and we wanted him to look at every single piece of research that existed in the year 2005 on self-regulation. And can you do me a favor, Mike? Can you pull it up? Yeah. You know the one I want, the hub. And this, for me, this is probably one of the most powerful things most powerful things that we've ever done. Now, what this represents is the current state of research on self-reg. And if you're interested, we can either give you all of the articles that are represented in each of these hubs, or even more valuable for you guys would be something called IMBES, I-M-B-E-S. It's the International Mind-Brain Education Society, and IMBES runs a news flash every 2 weeks in which they report all of the discoveries of the last 2 weeks. They give you a general description and then the link so you can read the papers if you want. And IMBES, for about the last 2 years, has essentially been reporting every 2 weeks at least a half a dozen papers that fall into this category. So that's where the science is. So then the question is, what's the story that the graphic is telling us, and how does it address what the minister just said? So I'll just do this. I won't do this properly as I usually do, but I'll just do one. Let's start at 12 o'clock. So there we've got autism, ADHD, learning disorders. Does that mean that these are self-regulatory disorders? No, it does not. These are biological disorders. These are neurogenetic disorders. And that's why we can't cure them. But as a result of the child's biological deficits, they develop constrictions in self-regulations. Self-regulation kicks in at around between the ages of 3 and 5. That's when these parts of the brain maturate. So if they have poor self-regulation, it exacerbates all of their problems. I don't know where you're sitting, pay attention. Pay attention, the point was made, like a child pays, he's taking out his energy from, there you are, he's taking out his energy from his bank. And the more he has a problem in self-regulation, the less there's in the bank, the less he can pay attention. So what we're trying to do with 12 o'clock is mitigate the consequences of the child's biological challenges. If we go to 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, let's do 2 o'clock or 2:30. So that's aggression, bullying, I'm blanking on the name. The point, those are mostly social now, okay? Or traumatization. But I don't care what the cause is, because I have a challenge now as a Canadian that this represents an awful lot of children. And so whatever may have happened to their brain, I don't have a pill for this. In fact, the pills make it worse. But what I can do is I can work on the thing at the center. And that's where George is right. Because the practices, they have to be individualized. And I don't know if Rod's talking today or not, but I mean, Rod is the architect of a model of education, which is perfect for this. You going to shut me down?
I just did.
Okay. That's what I meant.
Taking your comment, Minister, and Stuart's slide, it reminds me that this isn't just another thing to tack on to the challenges of what teaching looks like today. This is a different thing. In fact, the replacing some of our well-worn and past their best due date norms with some new norms isn't just good for kids who have some of these specific challenges and who are identified. It's good for every kid. It's not something that you say, well, I've got to do my regular stuff with this group and then these special techniques with this group. The so-called special techniques work for everyone because, believe it or not, we're all somewhere on a continuum with most of these things. So how do we, the second question I have, and then I want to get out to the tables, is what does it look like, and I don't want to beat up on our pre-service training institutions, but what does it look like for us to head upstream, just as we're attempting to do with children, with Strong Start and families, how do we head upstream and dramatically change the paradigm within which young, emerging teachers develop their craft? Because if we fill this room right now 10 times over with the people who are in the 3rd and 4th and 5th year of professional training, most of them, their eyes would be wide open, they'd be scribbling notes till they had hand cramp, and they would say, this is news to me. Yep. We can't afford another generation of news to me. Yep. We've got to influence significantly, and this isn't a moment in time, this isn't a fad, this is a watershed moment. How do we have that impact, and how do we work with the education community, with the university communities, and with your colleagues in post-secondary to make sure that this has some traction?
Well, I'll start, and I think it comes first from a recognition that we are not all born, well, none of us are born with all of the knowledge in all of the areas we need to be something as important as a teacher. We're not all born with that. I'm a former teacher, actually a former member of the BCTF, way back in my past, and by any means.
I want to get out to a couple of tables. We've got a microphone there. Is there another one at the back? Table 23, there was a question, wherever table 23 happens to be. There you are, close to the back, and followed by table 10. Rod?
Good morning, and thank you, Mike. We've been dealing with issues around self-regulation for early learning students, for young students. What about for older students or secondary students?
So let's see if I can tie this in with what the minister was just saying. Everybody hear the question? Okay, so obviously self-regulation is a continuum, right? We want to, it's never too late to help a child. And even if we've done a great job in Strong Start or primary school, we have to continue to reinforce this. One of the questions that I think is probably on everybody's mind here is, everybody talks about the importance of brain science, but how does it really impact what we're doing here? And you should understand that brain science is moving very, very quickly. And we had a discovery reported last week, which is absolutely critical to that question. We know that there are 3 periods of brain explosion, of brain plasticity in a child's life, essentially 0 to 3, just before puberty and around the age of 20. And the question is why? Why would nature have selected this period of another brain explosion at puberty? And our assumption has always been, well, it's because of the demands, the physical demands. As the child goes through, the brain is preparing itself to deal with it. just have this, I can inhibit anything. So the report that came out last week was absolutely pivotal for us, because what reorganizes at puberty is the child's stress response system. Everything I've been talking about today. And it looks now like John Abbott actually came up with a brilliant insight on this that now science is confirming. What did we discover? Up until puberty, the regulation is primarily adult-child. At puberty, the child switches, and it becomes peer-peer co-regulation. And the brain is now adapting itself to these co-regulation influences. So what we want to do is, obviously, we want to have the bikes in the high school. We want all that stuff that we've been talking about. But there's something else going on. And I'll just do it real fast. I thought the minister said something this morning highly provocative and highly intriguing. You know, he's talking about the school becoming the center of this new spiritual source, which our children desperately need. And as he was talking, I was thinking about a group of children that I saw yesterday on Sunday, whenever that was. And they were First Nations, and my son's just playing AAA hockey, and they were Bantam and Midget. And they were the happiest kids, and I was looking at them co-regulating. The parents were all on the side. They had moved now into this sphere where they were moving towards this healthy, happy future. And I mentioned to the minister last night at dinner, it struck me when I was looking at them. Now, for the first time in my life, I understood why we adore the Canadian juniors. Why, when the Canadian juniors play, this is this group of teenagers, and as a nation, if you watch TV, you see all these adults cheering. This is a very ancient thing that's being played out here. This pride we take as adults in this next generation that's moved to this next. So if we want healthy brain development in this population, we have to do all the stuff we've talked about, plus what he said. Plus, they have to have all the things so that we get every one of them in something where they're with their peers, whether it's a theater group, a music group, something. But if they're alone, then we get what we saw yesterday in Oakland. That's the truth.
Can I just add in I'll keep it down to 30 seconds because I know I go on way too long. But the other thing I think about the older students is that the critical thing is what we talked about yesterday, which was in grades 9 to 12, basically allowing the students, the kids, to explore the areas of their passion. The AAA hockey player we talked about earlier with FASD is super that he'd been able to make all that progress and succeed. At some point, we are going to have to excite him about a career that works for him. And again, I think we're doing a great job of that, and let's do more, as we talked about yesterday, because that's going to be the next thing. Once the hockey's done, is he going to be excited about building buildings, operating equipment? He'll be able to do all of those things, I suspect, and let's give him that opportunity to succeed in that area as well.
So again, referring to John Abbott's book, he reminds us that secondary schools were invented to deal with the affliction of adolescence. It was seen as a, I don't think he called it a disease, but I can't remember the word he used. And the structure was to suppress this affliction. If we, knowing what we now know, back to my initial comments, when will what we know change what we do? Knowing what we now know, would we design the structure, the routine, the rhythm of secondary schools for those adolescents you asked about as it's currently designed? I don't think so. In fact, much of what happens, in spite of the best efforts of all of the people in those places, or many of the people in those places, is pushing up against some regulation and some norms that are counterintuitive. They're certainly counter-cognitive. We had a parent meeting a few weeks ago for one of the areas in our school district, and one of the parents at the table I was at said, a challenge is, you know, my kid has math at 8:15 every morning. Terrible thing, math at 8:15, and he's not a math kid. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, I agree. It is a terrible thing. Both parts, terrible thing. Just kidding. But I said, what I'm going to do tomorrow is send a memo out to the district saying from next week on, we're going to start secondary school at 10 or 10:30 and go till 5:30 or 6, because we know some things about the teenage brain. We know some things about when they are active and when they are not. And we know that 8 and 8:15 in the morning is part of the not. And I looked around the table and I said, I'll send that memo out tomorrow and I'll be gone by the end of the week. Because I'll get killed. Because people will say, that disrupts, my kid works at Starbucks at 3:15. She's got a shift. Or I want my kids out of the house before I leave. I want to lock the place up, and if they're still in bed, who knows what might happen, et cetera, et cetera. And those are all legitimate concerns, but when do we overwhelm those concerns with what we actually know about science, what we know about the developing brain, what we know about the adolescent brain, what we know about real engagement for kids to break away from the structure of bells and subjects and so on. Table 10. Go. Yeah.
Thank you. So, Stuart, you started out your presentation today saying that intensive parent involvement in the clinical setting was part of your success with these students. And you further went on through the presentation to talk about the dose effect, and that this also required parents to be involved after school hours with their children. And I guess my question goes where Mike further then commented, when will what we know change what we do? And I guess you've hit on a very passionate subject for parents, where parents do want to be involved in their child's education and they want to support their children. Not all parents are born and have those skills once they have children to support their learning and their education. So I guess my question really goes to, what is it that we as a group can do to commit to including parents in this important work that needs to happen with individual students? How do we move beyond the IEP to engage parents with their child, with educators, to move forward so those parents with that individual child can learn the skills and the tools that they need, that is going to even include helping them in their homes and in their families?
Do you want me to answer that, Mike? So I was in Ireland all last week, and that's exactly what we were working on. And we're working in some regeneration areas, and they tried parental education, where these are parents that are in a lot of trouble, and they force them to come in, and or they either force them or they bribe them. And the results have been absolutely terrible. And so they were all complaining to me, and they said, well, you know, we just can't get them to come. And the only ones who come are the ones we really didn't want. So I said, okay, so I'm going to bet you now, I'm going to bet you £5 that I can fill your community hall on Friday night, but I get to do whatever I want. So everybody took the bet. So I had the staff go out, and we put up signs all over. This is a little community in a regeneration zone, and it said free beer and pizza Friday night. So I made a lot of money last week. But the point is, we want to get them in the door. That's the first thing. And I thought the minister touched on this morning with the importance of the public health. You know, this is a wonderful resource that we have to reach out to parents, to make them feel welcome. But what we don't want to do is give them homework. What we don't want to do is they're going to give them assignments. Look, these are parents that, 80% are going to have severe problems in self-regulation themselves. And so the last thing I want to do is make them feel worse. The last thing I wanted them is to see me as somehow responsible for all the things that we're going to bitch about with your kid. And what we really want to do is figure out strategies that will calm them down, will teach them how to identify their own. So we use things like parent-child yoga. And we'll say to the parents, you know what, you know, your child's going to do wonderful with yoga, but we found that really we can't get kids to come without this is little guys, we can't get kids to come without their parents. So can you bring them, you know, and parents will do anything for their kid. And it doesn't matter what the parents are struggling with, they will do anything for their child. And so now what we're going to do is try to figure this out. And I love what Mike's been saying all morning. You know, this is the beginning of a journey. But the beginning point of the journey, when we talk about self-regulation for child, family, community, school, is that we're going to, if we reframe a child's behavior, we're going to reframe a parent's behavior too. So the last thing we want to do now is we want to label, I won't label a child, I'm not going to label a parent. I'm not going to talk about the permissive parent, the authoritarian parent. It's a parent. And you don't know what they're going through unless you've been there. And so instead what we want to do is let's get them in, let's engage them in the process. They will only engage in the process if they enjoy it. They will only come back and volunteer and ask you questions. What do you do when this happens? If they are empowered by this experience. And so it's a move, the minister sits on the outs this morning. I'm trying to remember all the things he said. It's less of a paternalistic thing. You know, he was giving the examples of these communities, I forget the two that you mentioned, which have changed their trajectory in the way that Mike's talking about. But what was common to the two examples that he gave was that the communities were the agent of change. We were there just to kind of, I mean, we as in him, were there to facilitate, to lend help, but they were the ones that were pushing this process along. So that's what we're looking at here. If it's going to be self-regulation, that's the key here. This is self-regulation. This is, I'm not going to regulate parents. I'm not going to regulate children. I'm not going to regulate teachers either. So what I want to do, I was listening as Mike was explaining all this, what I want to do with these young students when we've got them in our hands is I want to teach them all this, and I want to teach them how to self-regulate so that, because it's such a stressful job, that they're aware. There are certain kids, there are certain emotions I find hard. I'm going to become reflective of this. I'm going to figure out why am I having this response, because it's just a kid. Okay, and I want to do that with everybody. Calm down. It's just a child. It's not a bad kid. This is the line you heard me say all the time. I'll finish on this, Mike. There isn't such a thing as a bad kid or a stupid kid or a lazy kid. But if you do the wrong things, you'll turn it into a bad, stupid, or lazy kid. That's what the minister is saying about these communities. That's what we did to them. So now we've got to figure out, how do we undo this? How do we change their trajectory? How do we nurture these abilities? Because the desire is actually there. It's always there. You don't have to create the desire. The desire to be a good parent, the desire to be happy, everybody has that. We just have to help them.
How do we infuse the room, not just this room, because it is infused with your examples and with your stories and with your research and with the results. How do we infuse the room of public education? A different dialogue, a different discourse, and the potential for success rather than the narrative of deficits. And how do we get all the partners in the room, whether it's at the Learning Roundtable, whether it's at local school districts? I don't think it's either or. I think it's a conversation that needs to be the central conversation. Otherwise, we'll keep recreating the past. Under stress, we parent as we were parented, we teach as we were taught.
Yep.
And what does it look like for us to move into an arena that's not simply the stress arena, systemically, politically, and otherwise, and into an arena that allows us to imagine and then go beyond imagination, start to scaffold and architect the preferred future? Minister.
Well, huge question, and actually as we've been talking over the past several months now about the BC Ed Plan and the very good things in the BC Ed Plan, how do we take the success stories that I've seen in over 100 schools, the best practices that I've seen in over 30 school districts now, how do we take what could be a pocket here or a node there and make that something that works right across the system? And so it's about the transmission and dissemination of knowledge and information. So I think that we do have some tools. We have the internet now, which, you know, many British Columbians are tuned into the internet. If somehow we can, if we can make the information that's been shared here today and the understanding that's been shared here today with 4.5 million British Columbians, I mean, we'd be way ahead of the game. I mean, if everyone in British Columbia had the literacy around this issue that we now possess as a consequence of having the opportunity to spend a day with a brilliant leader in this area like Stuart, and the opportunity to build on the other strengths that we all bring here, I think it's hugely powerful. So I think about things in terms of reaching those 4.5. Yeah, the internet's one way, but I think we also need to start thinking about when we have a professional development day, and we're going to talk about self-regulation at that professional development day. Maybe we invite some parents to come along too, because I think, and I'll bet that the superintendents and the principals spend more time than they would ever want to imagine with parents who have educated themselves to a point about what they think their child will be diagnosed with, and forming some assumptions from it, probably many of them false or inappropriate, and then driving you nuts by saying you need to do this in the school system. So anytime we can build public literacy around these issues, I think we should take advantage of it, whether it's a professional development day or maybe it's just a special session we put on as a government and bring people in who can, not just Stuart, but the Pat Mirandas and the Adele Davidsons and so on, or Adele Davis, that can tell us about this world and how we can better manage it in our education system.
It seems to me that many of the things we've been talking about regarding the individual child and the development of the individual are true for our systems. Some of the characteristics you described of individuals have been evident over the last several months in this province as parties bash each other around the education dialogue and the journey that we're on. This, I think, presents us with a real opportunity to turn the page and to go to new and better places.
Sure hope so.
We're going to need to close, and I'm going to invite James Gorman to bring the session to a formal close. Dr. Shanker, it's always a pleasure. Minister Abbott, thank you. I don't think this is the end of the conversation. I think this is the first chapter in a really important book in the history of our province and our society.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's where we go from here, and I know James is going to sum it up, but this has just been, for me, a fascinating day, and again, we're starting to unlock, I think, some of the great potential here, and I think you're absolutely right. This is the first page, perhaps the first chapter in a much longer book, which will lead to hopefully a great education system. James, sorry.
Thank you, and I'd like to add my thanks to the Minister and to Dr. Shanker for taking the time. I'd also like to thank you, Mike, for helping keeping the conversation going and on track. Not that these two gentlemen would ever veer off track. So thank you very much for that. And I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time, taking a day and a half out of what are, I know, very, very busy schedules to come and spend this time with us. I hope you found it useful and valuable. I'm hoping that what you found from today is that this is the beginning of a conversation, and it has to become what I think is quite a focused conversation. And I know that the Minister's committed to beginning that, and that's what we would like to do. And I think you're going to find there's much more opportunity for conversation about this in the days and the weeks ahead. With respect to yesterday and very much the focus on the implementation of the Education Improvement Act, I would offer you that we talked a lot about what information is publicly available, what information is now entering the public domain, and the considerable amount of misinformation that is out there. If you need direct information, please do not hesitate to contact us, and if we don't have the answer, we can get you an answer very quickly. Rather than try and have you navigate through the ministry, Sherry Mahorek, who is our superintendent liaison, and she can be reached at sherry.mahorek@gov.bc.ca. And I would invite you to either email Sherry. Your superintendents all know how to contact her directly by a phone. And let Sherry navigate the ministry for you, and we can get you answers very quickly to anything you need, information sources or what have you. So I would invite you to take full advantage of that. So with that, once again, thank you so much, and until we meet again, which I'm sure won't be too long, I wish you safe travels.